The last 24 hours has seen a limited amount of information coming from the Ukrainian battlefronts, though the Russian Ministry of Defense continues to report advances by the Wagner forces in Bakhmut. I'll come to that shortly. And in addition, we've also had reports that there have been small incremental Russian advances in various other battlefronts, parts of the battlefront as well. Interestingly, at the moment, it continues to be the Russians who are recording the advances. But as I said, I will discuss these reports in more detail in a moment. Before I do that, I just want to touch on two very strange stories that have appeared and have gained a certain circulation. One is the story about the mysterious flash over Kiev. Of its existence, there is no doubt whatsoever, but there is incredible amount of uncertainty as to what caused it. Initially, many reports suggested that it might be a Russian missile strike or some sort of a Russian attack. Then the Ukrainian authorities said that it was a NASA satellite falling to Earth, and that story was picked up and republished by various Western news outlets, including The Guardian, by the way. And then a few hours later, NASA came out and said that this wasn't correct at all. In fact, the satellite in question is still in orbit, and now the official line, repeated loyally by all publications, is that it was a meteorite. Maybe it was. I don't know. I have absolutely no way of knowing one way or another. However, it is the case that there was quite a lot of Russian air activity yesterday. There were reports that Uranium-2 drones had been launching strikes on various locations across Ukraine. There were even some suggestions that there had also been missile strikes in Odessa, and I believe in Dnipro as well. So perhaps there was some kind of military strike, possibly, and perhaps these stories about first a satellite and then a meteor are intended perhaps to disguise the fact that with the current depleted condition of the Ukrainian air defense system, Ukraine wasn't able to respond quickly enough or effectively enough to whatever it was that came down, that the Russians launched. I don't know. On the subject of air defense systems, it appears that Ukraine has now received at least one Patriot missile system. This is not the one that has been donated by the United States. It is one that is coming from either Germany or the Netherlands, or perhaps both. After the US announced back in the winter that it was providing Ukraine with a Patriot anti-aircraft missile system, Germany announced that it would do the same, and then the Netherlands made a similar announcement shortly after. I'm not entirely sure whether the German and Dutch systems are one and the same. I do know that the Dutch and the Germans do cooperate in some areas, or whether in fact Germany and the Netherlands are each supplying a Patriot system. I'm going to assume that it is the second, that Germany and the Netherlands are each supplying a Patriot system, which would bring the total number of Patriot systems being supplied to Ukraine at 3. But I should say straight away that I'm not absolutely sure about this, because when the announcement came from Ukraine that the Patriot system had been received, Ukraine thanked both the Germans and the Dutch. Perhaps both systems were delivered at the same time. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. It may be that this Patriot system will plug some gaps, and there were some reports yesterday that Ukraine is shifting some of its air defense systems. I gather these are short-range systems to the area closer to Donetsk, perhaps in an attempt to provide some degree of air defense for the Ukrainian forces fighting in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, who's to say? But anyway, I doubt that the delivery of this Patriot system or Patriot systems is going to make any fundamental difference to the overall picture. There's been much discussion about this. Even the United States itself essentially admits as much, and I don't see why we should look behind it. It's likely that the Patriot system will be depleted quickly, just as Ukraine's own systems have been, and I doubt that its presence is going to affect Russian air capabilities substantially, with the Russian Air Force now becoming more active and more aggressive. And of course, anyway, the Russians are likely to be on the hunt for these Patriot missile systems, which they don't appear to consider to be as effective as their own or as the old Soviet systems, which the Patriots are replacing. Anyway, the Russians are going to be on the hunt for these systems, and we'll see what comes. But anyway, there we go. So that's the situation with that rather odd flash in the sky over Kiev. I don't know what caused it. I will say that on balance, when you see a big flash in the sky over a city that is in the midst of a war and which has suffered repeated missile strikes and air raids, the logical assumption is that the flash has something to do with that. But if it was a meteorite, well, I'm going to accept that as a fact. I mean, we'll see one way or the other, or perhaps we won't. But anyway, there it is. I can't say more about this incident. The second incident is even more bizarre, which is that Alexei Danilov, who is the Secretary of Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council, in my opinion, by far the single most powerful institution in Ukraine, more powerful than the Ukrainian government, the defense ministry, or President Zelensky himself in some respects. Anyway, Danilov has now come out with a statement that the man who visited the headquarters in Kherson and in Lugansk region wasn't actually President Putin of Russia, but a double, that this whole affair was staged. There's claims that the pictures of Putin's helicopter, which show him landing in Kherson, weren't actually filmed in Kherson, and that the man in the pictures is actually a double. Well, I'm not going to take any of that seriously. I think that is complete nonsense. I can't imagine why the Russians would stage such a bizarre performance. It wasn't just people like Lapin and Makarevich, the two generals who met with Putin. Scores of other officers and individuals were present as well. Certainly, there's pictures of Putin leaving the meeting with Lapin, and there's, as I said, several other officers there in attendance. So I can't frankly believe that this incident was staged in the way that Danilov is saying. And frankly, the Russians have already ridiculed that idea. By the way, on that topic, Putin attended a meeting on economic matters with the government just yesterday. The first part of the meeting was devoted to hearing a lengthy report from the relevant government minister about plans to develop the newly annexed territories. I use the word annexed, unified territories. Anyway, there's the four regions Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Lugansk. Putin discussed his brief impressions of what he saw whilst he was physically present at attending these two meetings. He spoke, for example, about the fact that the cars that were still being driven seemed to be predominantly still Soviet-era Ladas and Zhigulis and that kind of car. And he spoke about the fact that it seemed to him that living standards in these regions were quite low, certainly by Russian standards, even though the places looked carefully ordered and clean and neat and those sort of things. He also talked about problems at a checkpoint. I suspect that these comments of Putin were inserted into this discussion in part in order to anticipate and refute the kind of somewhat bizarre claims we've just heard from Danilov, and which, by the way, have predictably been picked up by some Western media outlets. I read an article in the Daily Telegraph by Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, one of these ex-military people who regularly writes about Ukraine. He predicts a military dictatorship in Russia. He talks about the country's imminent total collapse, that kind of thing. And he also says that nobody he knows, that's to say nobody Hamish de Bretton-Gordon knows, seriously actually believes that it was really Putin who visited the headquarters. Well, I think all I will say about that is that I would suggest that Hamish should start speaking to rather more people. It might be useful if he started to get a broader perspective on what is actually going on in this war. Anyway, those are the two really very odd stories that have appeared over the last 24 hours. For the record, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that it was indeed Putin who we see these pictures, and that he did indeed meet with these officers, and he did actually meet them in their headquarters exactly as the Kremlin says. I want to just make that clear, just in case anybody has any doubt. But anyway, let's get back to what we do know about the military situation in Ukraine. And there are now reports that after a somewhat fraught meeting a few days ago, these, I should say again, are rumours, that after a fraught meeting a few days ago in Kiev, when Zelensky apparently gave orders that the offensives be launched as soon as possible, irrespective of weather conditions, and spoke about the need in particular to launch the counterattack near Bakhmut as soon as possible. Anyway, General Syrskyi has apparently come back. This is the Ukrainian commander of the ground forces, and has allegedly told Zelensky that it is still impossible to launch the counterattack to relieve Bakhmut because of the bad weather conditions. And adding to the sense of unreality about much of the reporting over the last few days, supposedly Syrskyi said that the bad weather around Bakhmut is unprecedented and is possibly the result of the Russians using some kind of new weapon that allegedly controls the weather. Again, I do wonder whether General Syrskyi really could have made such an extraordinary, given Zelensky such an extraordinary report. If he did, then all I can say is that Zelensky needs to consider whether perhaps Syrskyi has been a bit too long in his job. What is actually happening in Bakhmut is that the Wagner organization, as I discussed yesterday, or a few days ago actually, is taking several blocks a day in Bakhmut. They're creeping closer to the Khomovo road, the one road that Ukraine is still able or has been trying to use to keep its forces in Bakhmut still supplied. And there are some reports, they're not very clear reports, but there were some reports yesterday which suggest that the Russians, that the Wagner organization, has indeed reached this road, and in fact isn't just reached this road, but is now advancing along that road and is presumably advancing to the northwest up this road in some fashion. Now, if that is correct, then this is a disaster for the Ukrainian forces. But that is a bit tentative. What is rather more clear is, as I said, that the Wagner organization is indeed capturing apartment buildings, blocks of buildings in Bakhmut. They're making progress doing so, apparently. And as I've said on several occasions, the amount of territory in Bakhmut which is still under Ukrainian control is now very small. I saw a map about a day ago. I believe it's from a Ukrainian source which coloured in the various areas of Bakhmut that are under the control of the respective parties. The area under Ukrainian control was put at around 10% of the metropolitan area of what is, let us not forget, a comparatively small town, 70,000 before the war. And I've seen other maps which seem to me to put this area even smaller. So the Ukrainians are clinging on basically to some buildings now in the west of Bakhmut. They're still apparently occupying the Avant-Garde Stadium, and I suspect that's tying down some Russian troops. But overall, the Ukrainian presence in Bakhmut is now extremely tenuous, or so it seems to me. This despite the fact that Ukraine continues to try to cling onto these small number of blocks of buildings in Bakhmut on the western outskirts and to the Avant-Garde Stadium that it still controls, even though I have to say that this seems to me a wholly pointless exercise. Now, there have also been some other reports from other parts of the battlefronts, and they suggest a succession of Ukrainian counterattacks in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, in the Avdeevka area, and further south in the Vuhledar-Marinka area, which the Russians say they have, in every case, successfully repulsed. Now, these reports are really quite interesting because they have been confirmed by, these counterattacks have been, the fact of them has actually been confirmed by a senior Ukrainian official, who rather astonishingly said that the fact that the Ukrainians are carrying out these counterattacks are in fact a part of Ukraine's counteroffensive, that the Great Spring counteroffensive has in fact already begun, and it's begun with these counterattacks. Now, I can't believe that is the case. I think that this is again an example of a Ukrainian official, perhaps either I understand this official is a civilian, either misunderstanding the situation or trying to talk it up in some way. Because no way can I see these minor attacks as evidence of some sort of Ukrainian counteroffensive. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that they have all failed, and that seems to be indisputable based on what some Ukrainian maps are suggesting. all of which seem to suggest minor, but nonetheless real, Russian advances across the front lines. And in addition, there's been another report, might even come from General Syrski himself, that the Russians have now changed their approach to the fighting in Vuhledar. Now that their air force is able to operate more effectively, it seems that they are launching precision-guided gliding bombs against these tall apartment buildings in Vuhledar, which lie on slightly high ground, and these buildings have been destroyed. The civilian population was evacuated apparently from Vuhledar some time ago, and the expectation is that with the destruction of these tall apartment buildings, the Ukrainians will lose that ability to look down on Russian military positions, to basically have an overview of the surrounding area that they have had up to this point, and that will enable the Russians to push forward and this time achieve a more successful outcome in Vuhledar than they have up to now. And well, we shall see whether that is indeed so and whether that does indeed happen, but there are complaints from Ukrainian sources that these precision-guided bombs are being used and that they are starting to have a serious effect all across the battlefronts. And we've had these reports about Vuhledar as well. So that is the summary of the information from the battlefronts in Ukraine. There's been a long article in the Financial Times about the training of Ukrainian troops who will be participating in this battle. I was rather shocked to see that some of these men who are apparently going to participate in this offensive are as much as 60 years old. I'm not sure that men of that age should be thrown into a battle like this. I'm not saying I don't think young men should be thrown into this kind of a battle either. But I do wonder whether men of 60 have the physical stamina for this kind of thing. The report, by the way, claimed that the soldiers who are participating in this battle, Ukrainian soldiers, have received training over a period of 6 to 7 months, but which is interesting, but of course unverifiable. But it also said that Ukraine, in order to fill up the gaps in its military, has had to engage in a major call-up since the winter, which is true, by the way. There have been multiple reports about this. But of course, if it was the winter, if we are talking about December, January, February, then of course people who've been called up like that will not have been trained for 6 to 7 months. I mean, it's mathematically impossible that they could have been, assuming, of course, that they are indeed going to be committed to the battle, which this article seemed to suggest that they might be. Now, the other thing about this article is that it effectively again admitted that for Ukraine, this is its last big throw. It's said that if Ukraine does not achieve significant progress as a result of this counteroffensive, support for Ukraine in the West will start to wane. Now, I have to say that this is an interesting topic about support in the West waning, and I think it perhaps requires some degree of examination. I don't believe that Western political leaders would, of their own volition, stop providing support for Ukraine beyond the summer, even if the offensive, this coming offensive, were unsuccessful. I think that the political investment and the emotional investment in Ukraine is far too big by now for these politicians, the political leaders, to simply choose to walk away. And of course, there is beyond that the consequences of a debacle, the sense of a debacle, if this were to result in a Ukrainian defeat, in a major Ukrainian defeat and a Russian victory. So I think that when there is discussion about Western support for Ukraine waning in the event of a failure of the offensive, the reality is that the purpose of the offensive is to try to achieve a successful outcome on the battlefield before the material constraints, the physical constraints on the amount of support the West can supply to Ukraine begins to kick in a serious way. Now, I've just seen the latest summary of weapons supplies that the United States is going to provide to Ukraine. There was another announcement yesterday, and here even I can start to see that the numbers are looking increasingly thin. There is the enigma of the South Korean donation of 500,000 shells. This has resulted in a strong reaction from Russia. There have been very negative statements about it from Dmitry Medvedev and from Maria Zakharova, who is the spokesperson at the Russian Foreign Ministry. They both basically said that any military supplies from any third country to Ukraine will be seen by Russia as a hostile act. And the South Korean government has been, I think, taken a little aback by these statements, and they've issued the kind of statements that one might expect of the current South Korean government, which is that they're trying to have it both ways. They don't want to anger either the Americans or the Russians. Medvedev all but hinted that if South Korea steps up supplies, well, he didn't hint, he actually said, if South Korea steps up arms supplies to the United States and if these arms arrive in Ukraine, then the Russians might consider their own arms supplies to North Korea, potentially altering the military balance even further in North Korea's favour. I say even further because, of course, as of this moment in time, North Korea has an indisputable superiority over South Korea in that it possesses nuclear weapons, and for the moment, South Korea does not. That might change, of course. South Korea certainly does have the capability to produce nuclear weapons if it was minded to. But supplies by Russia of advanced conventional weapons to North Korea would be a matter, I think, of very serious concern to the South Korean government. So the South Korean government has come out and said that though there is no actual legal constraint on South Korea supplying arms to Ukraine, which is something that they want to say to appease the Americans, at the same time, they're also saying that they want to keep relations with Russia on a stable footing, which suggests that they're not going to provide a large amount of arms to Ukraine, or perhaps any more arms to Ukraine at all. Anyway, we shall see. But I am starting to wonder whether these 500,000 shells that South Korea has now provided to the United States, whether all or even most of them are indeed going to turn up, not perhaps directly, but through a process of displacement, if you like, in Ukraine. By displacement, I mean South Korea supplying shells to the United States, and the United States thereby feeling able to supply some of its own domestically produced shells. South Korea supplying shells to the United States, and the United States feeling better able to supply some of its own domestically produced shells to Ukraine. Well, I'm starting to wonder whether that is the case, because as I understand it, US arsenals of shells are now so heavily depleted indeed, and with a looming crisis, possibly in the Pacific, it does seem as if the primary purpose of this deal with South Korea was not, as I initially thought, to provide more shells for Ukraine, but to replenish America's own arsenals for its own particular needs. Now, I say that I do need to be careful because I'm not absolutely sure that this is the case, and it may be that I'm going to change my view again on this, but that seems to be the prevailing position at the moment. So if that is correct, if this is indeed the situation, then Ukraine, with a limited number of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and very short of ammunition, if it fails in this offensive, it may find that the Western powers are not able or are unwilling to supply more. And that is why this offensive has to happen. It's more about material limits than lack of political will. And here I would say that a lot of the talk now, as a consequence of this, is beginning to revert again to diplomatic options. And there's been a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs, one of these media outlets that is reliably reflective of thinking at the highest levels of the US government. And it says that the West needs a new strategy in Ukraine, a plan for getting from the battlefield to the negotiating table. Now, I'm not going to discuss this article in detail because it has been brilliantly discussed by Joe Laurier in Consortium News. I'm going to, in fact, instead read a few points about this article which Joe Laurier makes. But Joe Laurier, quite correctly, references this article back to the leak of the papers, the Pentagon Papers 2, which, as he correctly says, show that Western audiences have been misled about the course of the war, that essentially what mainstream media has been reporting about Ukraine has been a pack of lies, that Ukraine is winning the war and is poised to launch an offensive that will lead to a final victory. Instead, the leaked documents show that the long-planned Ukraine offensive will fail miserably. Well, that's perhaps going a bit far, but it does seem to me that the documents do seriously cast doubt on the prospects of this offensive, and we see now a whole series of comments from Western officials which all but admit as much. And the article by Joe Laurier makes the point that a discussion of these leaks and about the problems with the coming offensive has been discussed in an article in the Washington Post which says that the leaks will likely embolden critics who feel the United States and NATO should do more to push for a negotiated settlement to the conflict. And Laurier then goes on to say that this concern is true, and we've now had this article in Foreign Affairs about the West needing a new strategy in Ukraine. And the article in Foreign Affairs can be summed up by a paragraph quoted by Joe Laurier from this article, which says the best path forward is a sequenced, two-pronged strategy aimed at first bolstering Ukraine's military capability, and then, when the fighting season dies down late this year, ushering Moscow and Kiev from the battlefield to the negotiating table. And then, as Laurier says, there's all sorts of talking up of Ukraine's military prospects and the likely prospects of this offensive. I would point out, by the way, that about a week ago, I discussed an article in The Hill by a former State Department diplomat, Mr. Earl Mack, who has just been to Kiev and knows the situation there and knows senior officials. And he seems to have come away pessimistic about the prospects of this offensive. Anyway, and getting the impression that the Ukrainians are pessimistic about the prospects of this offensive. But then the article in Foreign Policy effectively admits it as much. It admits that with the Russians possessing numerical superiority and Ukraine facing growing constraints, these are taken from the article itself, on both its own manpower and help from abroad, even if the Ukrainian offensive does retake some territory. It's not clear quite why the Russians would want to negotiate with a weakened Ukraine, a Ukraine whose military capabilities have been weakened. And then, of course, Joe Laurier makes the absolutely key point, and this is now taken from Joe Laurier's article in Consortium News. He says the strategy of going ahead with an offensive the US knows will achieve little, or Kiev knows will achieve little, is Kiev's last gasp, unless delusional neocons continue to outmaneuver the realists in Washington. Most importantly, for the West, the failure of this last gasp attempt would serve as a way for it to escape for the disaster it has created for itself, namely the backfiring of the economic war on Russia, the failure of the information war in the non-West, and ultimately defeat on the battlefield in its proxy war. And Joe Laurier reminds us all that back in February, Scholz and Macron, in their meeting with Zelensky, were also pushing Zelensky, towards negotiations and telling him that the situation has now reached that point where negotiations might become unavoidable. And this came shortly before we got that strange report in the New York Times about a pro-Ukrainian group having attacked the Nord Stream pipelines, the 6 guys, and a boat story. I think Laurier is absolutely right. I think that is exactly what is going on. I think that there is now an attempt to get this offensive going and hope that Ukraine achieves something which will somehow strengthen Ukraine's position in the negotiating tables. At least that is perhaps the more realist view in Washington. The neocons, I think, still have an alternative view. it was again apparently, this time in foreign policy, that gentleman from the International Institute of Strategic Studies came up with the idea that the victory in the offensive would have to happen within the first 24 hours, and that the offensive really depended on paralysis within the Russian military and political leadership, and panic on the part of the Russian army, which to my mind essentially admits that this offensive is as much about creating a political crisis in Moscow and perhaps triggering some kind of regime change crisis there, as it is towards achieving victory on the battlefield. And that might be the neocon thinking. Now, what about Ukraine itself? What is Ukraine thinking as it presses forward with this offensive? Well, I'm going to make a suggestion that in the case of President Zelensky, the calculus now has become extremely simple. He must hope that this offensive not only succeeds, but delivers him victory on the battlefield. Because from his point of view, he doesn't want negotiations now. He had a chance back in March, April of last year to negotiate a peace settlement. He walked away from it after making proposals which the Russians said they were, with some qualifications, willing to accept. And I think now, if after more than a year of fighting, he turns up to the negotiating table following either a military defeat or a failure to break through and achieve victory, and perhaps under pressure from the West, if he turns up and says that there has to be a negotiation, he must know that the Russian terms will be harsher than they were last year, and he must know that his own position as Ukraine's president is in serious doubt, and at the very least. Now, many people don't know this, but in the last year, 2 years of the Second World War, especially in the last year, the German leader, the leadership of Germany at that time, were in fact telling various people who were concerned about the situation, particularly military people, that Germany needed to battle on and needed to achieve at least some big victory on the battlefield in order to resume, in order to find some kind of diplomatic, to put itself in a position, a strong position, from which it could pursue some kind of diplomatic outcome. Now, that, of course, dragged the war on, and of course that major military victory never came, and Germany's position got weaker and weaker and weaker, and as everyone knows, the eventual result was Germany's complete capitulation and absolute defeat. But of course, the other point to say about that is that the German leadership were not sincere in saying this to the various people, the various concerned officials, military officials and others who were coming to them to talk about the situation. Because they knew collectively, and the leader of Germany at that time knew particularly, that they would not survive politically and perhaps physically Germany's defeat. So for that reason, they had an incentive to prolong the war. Now, I'm not making direct parallels today. I don't think the situation is anything like as apocalyptic as it was in that war. I'm not suggesting that any party to this war bears any resemblance at all to Germany in the 1940s. But what I will say is simply this. I think the calculus in this case, on the part of some people in Ukraine, may not be dissimilar. They do not want negotiations. They do not want compromise, because they know that anything short of total victory will result in their political end. And on top of that, that unfortunately is causing them to gamble, and gamble both on retaining Western support and on panicking the Russians into some sort of capitulation, because they know that they have no future politically if they achieve anything less. So that, I think, is why the Ukrainians are pushing forward with this counteroffensive. So you have an extraordinary witch's brew. You have the realists, or so-called realists in Washington, who want the counteroffensive because they think that's going to put Ukraine in a stronger negotiating position. They don't want to consider the possibility that it might, on the contrary, place Ukraine in a weaker negotiating position. We have the neocons in Washington who have gambled recklessly, and we go back to what Laurier is saying about the failure of their strategy, the backfiring of the economic war on Russia, the failure of the information war in the non-West. They can't face the third prong of that, the ultimate defeat on the battlefield in the proxy war. And they still hope that the Russian political leadership, military leadership will be paralyzed. I don't quite know what that means, by the way, but anyway, they'll be paralyzed, unable to make decisions. The Russian army will panic. There will be an uprising by the elite against Putin in the Kremlin. Putin is so nervous and frightened that he's not even able to go and face his commanders on the battlefronts. He's hiding in the Kremlin, resorting to the use of doubles, all that kind of thing. So that's what the neocons hope and want to believe. And lastly, there's the Ukrainians themselves, probably with a better and more realistic understanding of what is actually happening, but unable to call off the offensive, partly because of the enormous pressure to proceed with it from the West, but also because they know that their continued political survival depends on it. And so we're going to have this offensive at some point. It may gain some ground in some places. There's talk now of some attempts to force the Dnieper River in Kherson region, this attack towards the Sea of Azov, possibly another attack towards Vuhledar. I think these multi-pronged attacks might be in themselves problematic if Ukrainian forces are as weak in manpower and material, and especially artillery shells, as some are saying. But anyway, it's possible that all of this will be done. It could be that we will see, differently from the offensive in the autumn, the Ukrainian offensive in the autumn, which went on for 10 weeks, that we will see an offensive which this time lights up like a big flash, and then if it doesn't succeed, if it's repelled, if it doesn't break through and achieve decisive results in the first, well, maybe not the first day, but the first weeks or so, that it will sputter out and into some kind of a stalemate, which, to be very clear, would prepare the ground for a subsequent defeat of Ukraine. Anyway, one way or the other, that's, it seems to me, what's going to happen. I know there are some people who still doubt that Ukraine will launch this offensive. I have no doubt it seems to me that all the political calculations now point firmly in the direction of such an offensive being launched. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of this offensive and about the idea that this might panic the Russians into a regime change crisis in the Kremlin, paralyze their leadership, panic their army, all that kind of thing. I want to return to the question of the big document leak in the United States. Now, the first thing I want to say is I want to come back to that article in the New York Times, which spoke about how the United States has supposedly penetrated the Russian military and political leadership at multiple levels. And this is all based upon a 27-page document. Now, when I said that, I'd assumed, when I first touched on this article, I hadn't read the article, which I should have done. But anyway, I hadn't read the article, and I assumed that the New York Times had actually provided us with the original of this article. It seems that it hasn't, and the result is that we don't know to what extent the New York Times has understood this article correctly about the United States really infiltrating the Russian military and political leadership and getting insight of what is really happening. Because it seems to me that it's based upon two stories. Story one is that there is apparently or allegedly been arguments between the FSB, Russia's counter-security service, and the Russian Ministry of Defense about the exact number of Russian military casualties. I don't take that report at all seriously. I don't see why it's the FSB's job to track the number of Russian military casualties and to argue this over with the Russian Defense Ministry. I would say that that makes no sense to me at all. This is probably a garbled misunderstanding of something that has actually been touched on several times in open sources, which is that the FSB, which has a counter-intelligence function, has been working in order to plug gaps in the leaking of information from the military to Ukraine and to the United States. Now, this has been well known for a long time that this has been going on, and I would add that there was a report just today that the FSB has caught up with some Russian police officials who have apparently sold private data about Russian individuals to Ukrainian sources, and that might be related to some of these incidents, these assassination incidents that have been taking place in Moscow. So that the FSB is doing its job, I can see how that might be spun into the bigger story. The other is this story about Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense and the arguments that took place, which, as I said previously, all of that is open source. You don't really need to have penetrated the Russian military and political leadership to any extent to know about it. The only information is that supposedly Putin called Prigozhin and Shoigu together to have a meeting in the Kremlin in order to broker some kind of compromise between the two, some sort of settlement. I've already said that I think that was probably what happened, and it's not difficult to work that out for oneself. So, I am assuming that this story about the US having infiltrated the Russian political and military leadership It's extrapolated from this report. The report, however, may not really give information to that effect. And like others, like specifically the British diplomat Craig Murray, I think this particular story has been spun by the New York Times and, by the way, by CNN in order to repair, if you like, some of the reputation damage caused to parts of the US intelligence community as a result of this leak. Now, that now brings me to the last particular point in this article, which, in this issue, which is the document leak itself. Because I have now had the further opportunity to read articles both by Craig Murray and by Elizabeth Voss on Consortium News about how this so-called whistleblower is supposed to have been, Jack Teixeira is supposed to have been identified as the person who leaked these documents. This 21-year-old young man is supposed to have leaked these documents. Now, I'm going to make a number of quick observations here. Firstly, I'm becoming rather concerned at the way in which, following the arrest of this young man, from whom we have heard up to now absolutely nothing, it has already been taken as read and is being reported in the mainstream media that he is in fact the leaker. There's been a lot of discussions about how such a young man might have access to such important documents, and that's been reported in a way that essentially says that he is indeed the leaker. Now, I have an old-fashioned view of these things. I don't think that is appropriate commentary before charges are brought and before a defence is presented. For all I know, this young man might very well deny that he had any role in the leak at all. So I just want to say that and get that out of the way. But the other thing is that after reading Craig Murray's piece and Elizabeth Voss's piece, it is only now that I have come to fully understand the role that parts of the media, specifically the New York Times and the Washington Post and the citizens journalist outfit Bellingcat, or perhaps self-declared citizens outfit Bellingcat, played in hunting down and identifying this young man as the leaker. And both Craig Murray and Elizabeth Voss point out that, Bellingcat, it has had a curious history. It's had an interesting perspective on events. It's taken a very strong pro-Western, anti-Russian position on many issues. There's the swirl of rumours that it's connected in many ways with the intelligence community. Perhaps one shouldn't expect that it would behave differently in a case like this, but that two newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, should play a role of this kind is really quite extraordinarily disturbing. Not only did they appear to have worked with Bellingcat to try to find this young man, not only do they appear to have a large stash of these documents that they are quoting from in this very selective way, as the New York Times did when they claimed that there's proof in the documents of the infiltration by the US intelligence community of the Russian political and military leadership. But, of course, they're not disclosing these documents. They're just giving, as I said, hints of them. So we're back, in effect, to the leaks, the selective leaks of information cleared with the intelligence agencies themselves, because that's clearly what's happened. And we've seen media outlets acting like a kind of law enforcement agency, only I'm not sure that law is in fact involved here, as a kind of enforcement agency acting on behalf of the intelligence community in order to lock up somebody who has disclosed information embarrassing to some people, perhaps, in Ukraine and in the United States. Now, I can understand why the US government might want to do that. I absolutely do not understand why media outlets would want to do that. I think it is wholly wrong and improper of them to have done it. And all I will say is that it's further proof of the extent to which media agencies in the West, big media agencies in the West, have become much too close to government, to the point where one can legitimately question their independence, and that they're behaving in consequence in improper and unjournalistic ways. I'm choosing my words extremely carefully, but I hope that it is on the conscience of the people in these newspapers that they have done what they have done. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. As I said, I'll be coming back with more developments over the next few days. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, both sides now are waiting for this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, if it comes. The Ukrainians are preparing for this offensive. The Russians are also preparing for this offensive. Their major priority at the moment is to improve their positions tactically on the battlefields in places like Bakhmut and in places like Avdiivka and elsewhere, Vuhledar. But neither side is going to make any big offensive moves until Ukraine makes its move. The Russians, as they did repeatedly in the past, specifically during the Second World War, will attack on the backhand. They will launch they will wait for the Ukrainians to come at them. They will weather the offensive. They will wear down the Ukrainian troops further. And once they've done that, that is when they will move onto the offensive themselves. So it's quite likely that until this offensive takes place, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, in a week's time, in 2 weeks' time, in May, perhaps even in June, until that happens, we won't perhaps see much change on the battlefronts. The two exceptions, I suspect, are Bakhmut and Avdiivka. I get the sense that the Russians are determined now to sort out the problem of Bakhmut once and for all. And I think, as I said, the Wagner organization is pushing forward hard in Bakhmut. By the way, there's also some reports that it's built up defences, or that the Russians have built up defences around Bakhmut to parry any Ukrainian counterattack there. Anyway, I think that the Russians are going to sort out Bakhmut over the next few weeks before the Ukrainian offensive is launched, and I think they might try to do the same in Avdiivka as well. Until this offensive comes, this Ukrainian offensive comes, I think we must wait and expect a period of quiet, or relative quiet, on the battlefields. The diplomatic activity continues as intensively as always. Lavrov, for example, is now in Cuba, where the Russians are apparently preparing to announce a strategic partnership with Cuba, and where Cuba is about to launch use of the Mir card. There's also all sorts of things going on the financial side. the inflation numbers in Russia, for example, are now below 3%. The Russian central bank has said that the annualized rate of inflation in Russia is now at 2.82% year on year. And there were some suggestions that this was down to the base effect, the fact that inflation was very high in the first quarter of 2022. But in fact, the rate of price growth week on week is actually also very low at the moment. And we might even conceivably be seeing deflation, in other words, a fall in prices in the summer, which, I will discuss all of that later, perhaps in my next program. And of course, there's also the fighting going on in Sudan, where I've had a long and very interesting email from one of our African viewers with explaining many things, but all of that I'm going to talk about in my next video. Until then, may I wish you a very good day. May I remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also support our work via our shop, where you can find all kinds of great merchandise, our hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, magic mugs, all the rest. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.